We're starting a new series today. We're going to work our way through a wisdom book in the Old Testament. The book is Ecclesiastes. The purpose of the wisdom books is to help us to know how to live well in this world. And Ecclesiastes has that same purpose, but is a bit atypical. Let's just jump right in. I'm going to read the first 2 chapters, and you'll see what I'm talking about. The words of the teacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Absolute futility, says the teacher. Absolute futility. Everything is futile. What does a person gain for all of his efforts that he labors at under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets panting. It hurries back to the place where it rises, gusting in the south, turning to the north. Turning goes the wind, and the wind returns in its cycles. All the streams flow to the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place where the streams flow, they flow again. All things are wearisome, more than anyone can say. The eye is not satisfied by seeing, or the ear filled with hearing. What has been done is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Can anyone say about anything, look, this is new? It's already existed in the ages before us. There's no remembrance of those who came before, and those who will come after, there will be also no remembrance by those who follow them. I, the teacher, have been king over Jerusalem, Israel, in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to examine and explore through wisdom all that is done under heaven. God has given people this miserable task to keep them occupied. I've seen all the things that are done under the sun, and have found everything to be futile, a pursuit of the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, see, I have amassed wisdom far beyond those who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has thoroughly grasped wisdom and knowledge. I applied my mind to know wisdom and knowledge, madness and folly. I learned that this too is a pursuit of the wind. For with much wisdom is much sorrow. As knowledge increases, grief increases. So I said to myself, go ahead, I'll test you with pleasure. Enjoy what is good. But it turned out to be futile. I said about laughter, it's madness, and about pleasure, what does this accomplish? I explored with my mind the pull of wine on my body, my mind still guiding me with wisdom, and how to grasp folly until I could see what is good for people to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. I increased my achievements. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself and planted every kind of fruit tree in them. I constructed reservoirs for myself from which to irrigate a grove of flourishing trees. I acquired male and female servants and had slaves who were born in my own house. I also owned livestock, large herds and flocks, more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. I also amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I gathered male and female singers for myself and many concubines, the delights of men. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also remained with me. All that my eyes desired, I did not deny them. I did not refuse myself any pleasure, for I took pleasure in all my struggles. This was my reward for all my struggles. And when I considered all that I had accomplished, all that I labored to achieve, I found everything to be futile and a pursuit of the wind. There was nothing to be gained under the sun. So then I turned to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what will the king's successor be like? He will do what has already been done. And I realized that there is an advantage to wisdom over folly, like the advantage of light over darkness. The wise person has eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I also knew that one fate comes to them both. So I said to myself, what happens to the fool will also happen to me. Why then have I been overly wise? And I said to myself, this is also futile. For just like the fool, there is no lasting remembrance of the wise, since in the days to come both will be forgotten. How is it that the wise person dies just like the fool? So I hated life because of the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for everything is futile and a pursuit of the wind. I hated all the work that I'd labored at under the sun because I must leave it to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether he'll be wise or a fool, yet he'll take over all my work that I labored at skillfully under the sun. This too is futile. So I began to give myself over to despair concerning all the work that I had labored at under the sun. And when there is a person whose work was done with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and he must give his portion to a person who has not worked for it, this too is futile and a great wrong. For what does a person get with all of his work and all of his efforts that he labors at under the sun? For all his days are filled with grief, and his occupation is sorrowful. Even at night, his mind does not rest. This too is futile. There's nothing better for a person than to eat, drink, and enjoy his work. I've seen that even this is from God's hand, because who can eat and who can enjoy life apart from him? For the person who is pleasing in his sight, he gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy. But the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and accumulating in order to give it to the one who is pleasing in his God's sight. This too is futile and a pursuit of the wind. Well, that was interesting, wasn't it, right? Like, is this guy a believer? Is he just an old cynic? What in the world do we do with this? It's kind of a puzzle, really, to know what to do with it. David Hubbard, a scholar and a person who wrote a commentary about this book, this wisdom book, Ecclesiastes, said this: anyone to whom the book of Ecclesiastes is not a puzzle has not yet read it. There are a number of puzzling features, starting with just the name of the book, right? Ecclesiastes. If you say it fast, it almost sounds like somebody's sneezing and somebody else should be replying like, God bless you, right? Ecclesiastes, chew, you need a tissue, right? So where did that name come from? Well, verse 1, we have this phrase, the words of the teacher. In the Hebrew, the original language of the book, that word for teacher is Qohelet. It's a noun, and it can be translated teacher or preacher. By the way, I'm going to call this guy Q for the rest of the series, so I don't have to keep saying Qohelet, right? The verb form of that word means to assemble or to gather, to call people together, to gather them together in an assembly because you're going to teach them something or you're going to preach to them. In the Greek translation of this book, the verb is ekklesia. You may have heard that before because it's the word for church in the New Testament. And the word for church in the New Testament literally means, it's not the building, it means assembly or gathering. In the English translation, the word got transliterated from ecclesia to Ecclesiastes to indicate the teachings of the teacher who called together the assembly. Guys, there's no test on this. That was just free, okay? Second thing that's really puzzling about this book is translating the key word. You heard a word over and over again. In the CSB, with the version I was working from, it was translated this way, futile. Right. The NIV, if you're reading it there, would be meaningless. In the Old King James, it was translated vanity, right? Vanity of vanities. Several commentators gave it this word: absurd, puzzling, senseless. Literally, the word is vapor. The idea is a complex combination of all these. Q is using it to mean something that's impossible to get a grip on or hold, plus absurd, plus it lacks ultimate value or satisfaction. So it's like a metaphorical word that doesn't translate well into any other language, it seems, other than Hebrew, but it carries that idea of it's a vapor. It's something that you can't get your hands around it. You can't grasp it. You can't hold it, because it's just it's ephemeral and it's absurd and it's meaningless. And so trying to get it, trying to chase it, trying to hold it is just a meaningless pursuit, is futile. It's like all of that wrapped up in one word, hevel. Third really puzzling feature of this book is much of this book is dark. And some parts even contradict other scriptures. It's obvious that not everything Q says is 100% true, which makes you wonder, like, why is it in the Bible? Why did God inspire this book? Why did mankind recognize this as being a book that God inspired? We say we canonized it, right? We recognize this part of Scripture. And for you and for me, what are we supposed to do with it? Those are great questions that we're going to work at as we go through. Let me just kind of say a few things more about our introduction. Ecclesiastes is an autobiography of sorts, and it tells of a man's quest to find answers. Now, as we go through his quest, you might find yourself wanting to say, skip to the end, right? Because we're uncomfortable with pain, and we're uncomfortable with challenges to our faith, and this book has got big doses of both of those. But listen carefully. This book has a message for teens. It has a message for college students. It has a message for busy parents. It has a message for successful business people, for politicians, for law enforcement officers, for teachers, and for pastors. This book has a message for people who've been Jesus followers for a very long time. It has a message for people who are very recent converts to the Christian faith. It has a message, a different one, for people who haven't embraced faith in Jesus. And it has a message for people who believe in God but don't believe in the afterlife. It's got a message for them too. But to hear the message, you need to hear the whole quest. So we're going to spend 6 weeks, because that's how long it's going to take us to get through this. Please don't miss part 6. That's when we get to the conclusions. And I think you really, really benefit from being part of that. There are 2 voices in the book. There's Q, and then there's the frame narrator. The frame narrator frames Q's teaching. He introduces Q and Q's teaching. That's chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. And then he gives his conclusion after Q's quest at the very end of the book. Q is the teacher, and he's the main speaker throughout almost all the book. Q is a composite, or at least likely, this is what I believe, he's likely a composite character behind whom you have both Solomon and Hezekiah, kind of like the 2 bookends of the royal wisdom tradition. Solomon at the beginning, Hezekiah at the end. These are 2 kings in ancient Israel, 2 kings who, in spite of their connection to wisdom, made very unwise choices. So I believe Q is a fictional composite of these 2 bookends. So Q is on a quest. I said that earlier. Q wants to know, what can he do that will result in ultimate value, ultimate purpose, ultimate satisfaction? He phrases it this way: what do I get for all my effort? Right? This chapter 1, verse 3. What does a person gain for all of his efforts that he labors at under the sun? What do I get? Like, I'm working hard, I'm chasing this, I'm pursuing this, I'm pouring everything into this. What does it do me in the end? What do I get for all of my effort? And is all the sacrifice and all the effort and all the pain and all that I put into it, is it worth it in the end? Was it worth it? Is it worth it? If you're running like crazy and you ever slow down, either voluntarily or involuntarily, because you have like a midlife crisis or an accident, or you go through depression, you may find yourself asking the same question that Q is asking here. Is it worth it? What do I get for all of this, for this pace that I've been running, for all of my effort? What do I get, and is it worth it? So Q describes the quest that he went on to try to figure out the answer to that question. And I think there are three parts to this quest in these opening 2 chapters. The first part is the pleasure quest. He's asking the question, will indulgence bring me lasting satisfaction? Like, if you want it, grab it. And I give myself absolutely everything. Will that bring me lasting satisfaction? Chapter 2, verse 1, he says, I said to myself, go ahead, I'll test you with pleasure. Enjoy what is good. But it turned out to be futile. Like, poof, just kind of like summarize. Who knows how long he put into this, right? Whether it was days or years, months, we don't know. But he's like, I tested, I enjoyed pleasure. Verse 2 says, I said about laughter, it's madness. What about pleasure? What does this accomplish, right? In the end, I explored with my mind the pull of wine on my body, my mind still guiding me with wisdom, how to grasp folly until I could see what was good for people to do unto heaven during the few days of their lives. He's like, I tried it all. Wine, women, wealth, anything. I took it, I bought it, I tried it, I smoked it, I drank it, I ate it, I did it. All that indulgence, Hebel. A few years ago, actually 2017, I was reading through the book of Ecclesiastes in kind of my morning quiet time, and I was reading back through that journal just recently, and I ran across this entry. It was called Running After the Wind. And this is what I wrote. I wasn't made to be a consumer. Chasing pleasure and comfort through indulgence and consuming experiences, stimulations, etc. is just truly running after the wind. You can't catch it. And even if you catch it, you can't hold it, right? You don't get lasting happiness through chasing pleasure. You can't indulge your way to happiness. Or lasting meaning. That's what Q is telling us. Part 2 of Q's quest was achievements. You could phrase it this way. Do hard-earned successes bring me lasting satisfaction? Maybe pleasure just kind of came at me and I didn't have to work for it. But if I really had to work for it and I did something that at the end of the day you can be like truly, truly proud of, will that bring me lasting satisfaction? That's his question. He kind of describes this in verses 4 to 11. He says, I increased my achievements. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself, and I made gardens and parks for myself, and I planted every kind of fruit tree in them, and I constructed reservoirs for myself from which to irrigate a grove of flourishing trees. And I acquired male and female servants, and had slaves who were born in my own house. I owned livestock and large herds, large flocks, more than any who were before me in Jerusalem. And I amassed silver and gold for myself, the treasure of kings and provinces. And I gathered for myself male and female singers, for myself many concubines. And I became great, and I surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. And my wisdom also remained with me. All that my eyes desired, I didn't deny it. I didn't refuse myself any pleasure. I took pleasure in all my struggles. This was my reward for all my struggles. But when I considered all that I had accomplished and all that I labored to achieve, I found everything to be, here it is, Hebel. Right? Futile, and a pursuit of the wind. There was nothing to be gained other than the sun. The result at the end was it didn't last. It didn't make me happy. It didn't fulfill me. I did it all. And the high I got from it just didn't stick with me. Back to my journal, this entry I entitled Chasing the Wind. This week I've had the opportunity to interact several times with a man who seems to be highly motivated to impress others. He uses a number of tactics such as dominating the conversation, telling stories in which he's the hero, name dropping, using big words, and belittling opponents. But it's all running after the wind. Every time he gains the admiration of somebody, he receives pleasure, but it's fleeting. He's never satisfied within minutes. He seems compelled to repeat the process, this time with a new listener. I'm convicted because I can relate to this man. I try hard not to do it the same way he does, but my motives are the same. I want people to be impressed with me. I am chasing the wind anytime I don't speak up, primarily because I'm concerned with my image and what people will think of me. I'm chasing the wind anytime I exaggerate the facts of the story so people will be impressed. I am chasing the wind anytime I think about what I want to be known for as a leader rather than thinking about my actual character and how I can best serve the people that God has placed in my care. It sounds like it will fulfill me, right? If I can just, my accomplishment is to get you to be impressed with me. But in the end, it will not last. Within minutes, I'll be pursuing the next means of doing it. It is chasing the wind. Solomon then describes the third part of his quest. This one we'll call wisdom. And he wants to know, do intellect and insight guarantee a better fate for me? And what will happen when my successor comes? Ecclesiastes 2, verse 12. Then I turned to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what will the king's successor be like? He'll do what's already been done. And I realized there's an advantage to wisdom over the folly, like the advantage of light over darkness. The wise person has eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I also knew that one fate comes to them both. So I said to myself, what happens to the fool will also happen to me. Why then have I been overly wise? And I said to myself, this is also futile. For just like the fool, there is no lasting remembrance of the wise, since in the days to come, both will be forgotten. How is it that the wise person dies just like the fool? Therefore I hated life because of the work that was done under the sun. It was distressing to me. For everything is futile and a pursuit of the wind. He wants to know, does intellect and insight, that's wisdom, right? Smarts and insight into how to apply it here, does that guarantee a better fate for me? and better for my success. No. Wisdom gives me an advantage during this life, but it's useless in avoiding death, and it's useless in guaranteeing that my successor will be wise. It's Hebel, Hebel, Hebel is futile. So at the end of round 1 of the quest, right? He's checked out pleasure, he's checked out achievements, he's checked out wisdom, right? Q is showing the signs of the beginnings of despair because he's like, this is the worst ever. Back in the day, I got to lead youth group and I would create games, and some of those games were great games. Some of them were not so great games, and every once in a while someone would take the liberty of reminding me of one of the games I created that wasn't so awesome. And I got thinking, like, as I've been attending our youth group this past year, I watched Tristan, he's our game boss, as he announces the game. Sometimes kids are all like super excited. Can you imagine if he announces, all right, this week's game is called Chase the Wind. We're going to go outside. Each one of you got your hands. It's kind of windy out. You run, you catch the wind, you bring it back to me. First person to catch the wind, bring it back to me in his hands, wins. You can never win that game, right? That would be a lame game like that. No one wants to play Chase the Wind, right? When you play Capture the Flag, you know if you win or not because you grab the flag, you bring it with you, you cross the line, right? You've got something to show. You play flag football, it's the same thing. You grab their flag, you know if you got it or not. You play Chase the Wind, you're like, oh! If you open your hand to look, you know instantly you didn't catch it. And if you ever did catch it, how are you going to bring it back and show it to Tristan? Right? And how do you catch the wind? You can't. And that's what Q is saying. Like, this game stinks. I'm so tired of playing this game. This is the worst youth group game ever, except I've been playing it my whole adult life. Catch the wind. Right? Try to find something that will be fulfilling, that will result in lasting value, purpose, make sense of my life, make sense of my sacrifice. Find something that will truly make me happy in the end. Verse 22, what does a person get with all his work and all of his efforts that he labors out of the sun? And his answer so hard is, nothing. Nothing. Every time you think you caught it, you open your hands to check, and there's nothing there. He's like, so here I am, verse 23, all my days are filled with grief and occupation is sorrowful, because even at night my mind doesn't rest. I'm recognizing, I'm chasing it, I'm trying to come up with a new way, a new plan, a new angle, some new strategy, and none of it works. At the end of round 1, Q is showing perhaps depression, cynicism, something dark, despair is kicking in. Also at the end of round 1, Q advises us to do one thing. And by the way, he's going to give the same advice, I think 7 times in this book. So let's just look at it. Verse 24, there is nothing better for a person than to eat, drink, and enjoy his work. I've seen that even this is from God's hand. Because who can eat and who can enjoy life apart from him? At the end of round 1 of his quest, Q advises us to enjoy life and work as much as we can. By the way, I want to do a quick aside and talk about the difference between pleasure and enjoyment. I think Q is kind of hinting at it here. Modern social scientists have really done a great job of helping us distinguish between pleasure and enjoyment. One of my favorite authors on this topic of happiness is Arthur C. Brooks. And so some of what I'm going to share with you next comes from him. Pleasure is something that happens to you. Right? Pleasure is something that happens to you. Suddenly you just feel, you sense pleasure. You get this happy tingle or whatever. Enjoyment is something that you create through effort. Pleasure is about appetites, right? Some bodily appetite gets satisfied. You love sweets or something like that. Enjoyment is about savoring the situation. You can think of it this way. Think pleasure is like a tub of ice cream. And you could eat all you want without any thought to like how you're going to feel later and how fat you're going to get, right? And versus enjoyment is like a dinner with friends. So pleasure is about appetites. Enjoyment is about savoring the situation. Pleasure is often done just on our own, versus enjoyment usually requires others. Like, you get so much more out of it if you're savoring the situation with other people Or with God, I just got back from a bike trip, and I rode several hours each day along the Erie Canal Trail, and it had such sweet time with God. That was enjoyment as opposed to just pleasure. One more big difference: enjoyment can take place even in the absence of pleasure, like during a workout. On that bike trip, I was riding, and it was quite hot, and I was just pedaling, and there were times when it wasn't pleasurable, but it was enjoyable, right? That's awesome. Here's one of the big points that Arthur Brooks repeatedly makes. The research shows that opting for pleasure is a mistake for happiness. The people who opt for enjoyment find more happiness than the people who opt for pleasure. Q says that to us. He's like, I poured myself into pleasure, and I was not happy long at all. So at the end, he says, listen, work on enjoyment. Try to enjoy your life and your work, what God has given you, because at least there's some value there. It still won't last forever, but it's not as fleeting as pleasure is. Opting for pleasure is always a mistake for our happiness, or choosing pleasure over enjoyment is a mistake if you want to be happy. Let's wrap this all up. I was thinking about it. We probably wouldn't invite Q to be a guest speaker at Panama Baptist Church. Like if he said, I want to come speak at your church, and he sent us ahead of time, like his transcript, and we didn't know it was part of the Bible, like he just sent us, it's Ecclesiastes 1 and 2, like this is what I'm going to say. We probably wouldn't invite him here. You might notice in the sections that we've read today, Q is not quoting scripture. He seems to have forgotten some really important theology, right? There's nothing about Jesus here. There's nothing about heaven here. And he sounds a lot like Naomi during her bitter days, only a lot more educated and perhaps cynical, right? However, by God's choice, Q and his teaching made it into the Bible, and he is our guest speaker for the next 6 weeks, although with commentary from N, the narrator, and other parts of the Bible. I want to give us two takeaways, if you will, as we wrap up part 1. First is this: please follow Q's quest, because Q has a word from the Lord for you. I really believe that. Q has a word from the Lord for you, even though it's going to come out perhaps in a very atypical way. Second takeaway at the end of part 1 is this: you probably know someone who's asking Q's question or feeling Q's tension. You probably do. But if you've been a Jesus follower for a long time, dear friends, hear this. It's very possible that because you have lived in the light for a long time, the light of Jesus and the hope and the peace that he brings, it's easy to forget how dark the darkness is. So if you've been a Jesus follower for a long time, that is awesome. And if you live in the light of that, that is awesome. That's worth celebrating and enjoying. But you probably know someone who's not there yet. They're asking Q's questions, or they're feeling Q's tension. And so my question to you is this: are you willing to feel their angst for a while? For the 6 weeks it takes us to get through this book, are you willing to feel the angst that they're probably feeling, this other person that you know is feeling? Because if you are, hear me on this, I promise that God will not waste that pain. It will be painful. Q's quest is not comfortable. At best, it's not comfortable. But if you're willing to sit with Q and go with him through his quest and wrestle with the angst that he's wrestling with, I promise that God will not waste that pain. And so I hope that you're willing to do that as we work through this series. And I look forward to working through it with you. We'll catch you in part 2.